There, this is Ian Grayling. I want to briefly explain my personal perspective on the application of professional standards, and this has been the result of over 30 years now of involvement in standards development in one form or another, from the early days of NVQ through to the development of the new education and training apprenticeship standards, which I've been involved with as Deputy Chair of the Education and Training Trailblazer Group. My continuing interest in standards nowadays is probably more to do with my belief that they have been misunderstood and much maligned, actually, by the formal education sector. Now, while you ponder that statement, I'll move swiftly on. So, what have these seemingly random images got to do with our education and training standards? Well, let's see. Firstly, I see standards as multi tools. Really, they're multifaceted tools, and I'm going to explore that a little bit very shortly with you. Secondly, there's only 20 of them. So what's that got to do with lemons? Well, as my daughter used to say, easy peasy lemon squeezy. Only 20. Not a lot to get your head around. Thirdly, as the saying goes, you can see the wood, but can you see the trees? Or can you see the wood for the trees, or the trees for the wood? It's quite easy for us to get lost in the very sort of generic nature of the standards, and I want to explore about how we see the wood for the trees. Okay. Fourthly, bog off, as they say. Well, it's not actually buy one, get one free. It's buy one, get whole load free. And we'll look at how those standards, how the standards often come mob-handed, if you like. You get involved with one and you find that you're getting involved with a lot of them. And finally, I think we're going to sort of look at seeing the trees, or if you prefer, seeing the wood. So we're going to actually look at some detail in those generic standards just to finish this off. So let's move on. So how on earth can the professional standards be the teacher's multi-tool? Aren't they just a bunch of idealistic statements created by people who have forgotten what it's like to see the whites of the learner's eyes in the real classroom or workshop with sharp implements? But they still expect us to jump through these particular hoops, not to mix metaphors, in order to get our QTLS badge. Well, actually, no. They have been created by people who are passionate about teaching as well as learning, and they have agonized about every word and comma. Admittedly, these standards were developed to support professional recognition, but standards have a much wider range of applications, and we need to recognize and support these. So, professional recognition is down in the bottom right-hand corner under the idea of developing individuals' knowledge, skills, and behaviors, and also developing systems and processes, because implementing standards often involves developing systems and processes. If we jump across to planning, the standards are very effective in determining strategic priorities or defining what strategic priorities should be. They're couched in those terms, the very generic terms, which means that we can talk about quality in a general sense rather than a specific sense, or subject specific sense, if you like. But more than that, they are very effective in providing us with the means of moving between strategy and practice, and we'll explore that a little bit more. Because they are strategic and generic in nature, they're very good at communicating mission, what needs to be done in a general sense without going into the specifics at that stage. They also, of course, are descriptors of quality. So you can use the standards as a prompt to research evidence-based practice. What exactly is best practice in relation to this particular standard? You can use the standards to visualize the outcomes or impacts that you're looking for in quality improvement. And once you have implemented some sort of quality improvement initiative, you can evaluate the same outcomes and impacts because you've already visualized what it is in practice you expect to see in meeting that standard. So I hope that makes sense. We're going to explore that more in a second or two. So, of course, we're looking at the education and training professional standards, and I don't expect you to be able to read that, but it's just doubling up the point that there is only 20 of them, hence easy peasy. So these are the little beauties that we're talking about. And I would argue that if your colleagues were to meet all 20, you and your organization would be heading for outstanding in any Ofsted inspection. So I think they're worth considering, and check that out by all means. Have a look at the Inspector's Handbook, and I think you'll see what I mean. Okay, you can download these, of course, from the Foundation's website, and you can also download them from your Canvas account as well. So I'll be placing them in a module in Canvas for you. Once you've become familiar with these standards, you will notice actually that they're very mutually connected, and we'll explore that more in a minute. And that relates back to that bog-off idea: you get one or you buy one and you get a whole bunch of others come along with it. Also note that when you're looking at these standards, I would encourage you to think about how, as an advanced practitioner, you are helping your colleagues to work with them, although they can, of course, equally be applied to your own professional practice. When we reflect on standards, it can, as I said earlier in the beginning, be a little bit hard to see the wood. That's the standards for the trees, which represent practice, if you like. If we first of all consider the standards themselves, they are very theoretical or conceptual, generic, and they're great, as I said earlier, in for talking strategy with managers, but they're far less obvious when you're trying to explain to a teaching colleague what that actually looks like in practice. You've probably come across this already with somebody saying, yeah, that's great, but what do you want me to do? We can all think in concepts, and we can all think and talk about concrete or practical experience, but sometimes we're less practice is in moving between the two in either direction. So moving, if you like, from the generic to the concrete in practice, what we've got to do is, we're familiar with this word in the sector, contextualization. We need to be able to think divergently, if you like, and be able to take that generic principle and think of some very specific examples of that in practice. Equally, we need to be able to look at practice and see what the generic principle is there, or where a generic principle is not really being hit or demonstrated. Okay, so I would argue, therefore, that it's actually useful for an advanced practitioner to practice those skills of moving between the generic and contextualized practice, and being able to recognize the generic principles in practice. And I don't know whether anybody listening to this sees anything familiar here. I'm thinking Kolb or Honey and Mumford and Sons, and models of experiential learning. Sorry about the Sons bit, I didn't mean that. So let's explore that idea a little bit more about moving from generic principle to applied practice. So here is the very first standard, number 1 out of 20. And it says, reflect on what works best in your teaching and learning to meet the diverse needs of learners. Now, as I said earlier, there was a whole bunch of poor so-and-sos who had to pore over every word of these standards, and I was one of them. So it's worth considering the wording carefully. And here's my take on that particular process. So there's the standard on the left. I've sort of split it into two parts. And on the right, I've made that a little bit more specific by suggesting that what we really need to do is to think about specifically what skills, knowledge or behaviours do we have at our disposal, if you like, do we own, that we can use in order to, this is the second part of the standard, ensure that every learner's needs are met. Now, you might say, well, where did every come from? It's not there in the standard, but my reason for saying ensure that every learner's needs are met are related to the word diverse. Now, diverse, of course, means a lot of things, including, very importantly, that we are meeting the needs of learners with protected characteristics and a broad range of learning needs. But I think implicit within that is the idea, therefore, that every learner needs are being met. So it is fully inclusive, if you like. Delving further into this process, and here's that standard again, we could deal with this particular standard if we were reflecting on what works best in our teaching and learning to meet the diverse needs of learners. We could deal with it in a very conceptual way, which is not terribly helpful. We could say, well, that's not a problem. I designed differentiated activities. But what I would really want to know there is, okay, if you design differentiated activities, how exactly are you doing that? So, yeah, okay, but how? I would be looking for something more like this. I incorporate a lot of collaborative projects where every learner has to engage actively in them. Each of them therefore brings varying knowledge and skills to the project and learns different things from each other. I also get them to self and peer assess, to record their vocational and their personal outcomes, and to identify blocks and misconceptions as they occur so I can pick them up and deal with them. Now that would actually impress me if somebody said that. Let's put this into a scenario then and look at how we can identify standards from real sort of situations. And this is quite a real situation, in as much that certainly I don't know if you look regularly at Ofsted reports, but certainly most of the ones that I do, that I look at, somewhere on the line mention insufficient stretch and challenge. So here's an example. Ofsted have criticised a lack of awareness of more able learners' needs and insufficient challenge. Learning goals are too vague and not followed up with any rigour. That may sound familiar. You may be just aware of this. So why the colour coding? Well, let's have a look at Standard 3 now. Inspire, motivate and raise aspirations of learners through your enthusiasm and knowledge. Now, I would argue that you can't inspire, motivate and raise aspirations of learners if you're not actually aware of some of their needs, and in this case the more able learners. Standard 13, it's similar in some ways to Standard 3. Motivate and inspire learners to promote achievement and develop their skills to enable progression. Well, if learning goals are too vague, then they're hardly going to motivate and inspire learners to promote achievement and develop their skills, because they don't really know what it is they're trying to do. 17, enable learners to share responsibility for their own learning and assessment, setting goals that stretch and challenge. Well, that clearly relates to that whole issue of insufficient challenge. There's also an implication there of learners sharing responsibility for that, which is interesting. And then standard 18, apply appropriate and fair methods of assessment and provide constructive and timely feedback to support progression and achievement. Well, that sort of goes to the heart of the Ofsted criticism about not following up with any rigour. We need to have good assessment for learning processes in place to follow up on setting goals, to check whether they are the learners are actually progressing towards those goals, and if not, then we can do something about it in a timely fashion. So straight away from that bit of criticism, we've got 4 standards that are relevant, I would argue. But there's more. So there's that same standard again. And this is where, at the beginning of this presentation, I talked about bog off, buy one, get one free, but made the point, actually, this is more like buy one and get a load free. So if we start at the bottom of that diagram on the right, reflect on what works best in your teaching and learning to meet the diverse needs of learners. Can we see how that's relevant? And if we're going to do that, then above that, standard 8, we probably need to maintain and update our knowledge of educational research to develop evidence-based practice. And if we, get a good feel for, what is current thinking from the evidence base, then number 9, we need to apply that theoretical understanding of effective practice in teaching, learning and assessment, drawing on research and other evidence. Okay, now that might cause us, and often does, I would argue, to evaluate and challenge our current practice, values and beliefs, which is standard 2. So we've got to be prepared to do that. We've got to be flexible in our minds enough to accept that perhaps we can do things differently and maybe better. And that might involve being creative and innovative in selecting and adapting strategies to help learners to learn. And 19, maintain and update your teaching and training expertise and vocational skills through collaboration with employers. Now, why is that relevant? Through collaboration with employers? Well, one of the ways that we ensure that we've got sufficient challenge, particularly for the more able learners, would be to be very aware of what's happening in that vocational area in real work situations at the moment, and to try and establish a series of challenges which are much more at least realistic, if not authentic, because they could actually be situated, if you like, within a real work situation. So we started off with 4 standards there. We've got another 6 relating to this issue. Oh my word, is there more? Are there more standards which might be relevant here? Well, what about 6? Build positive and collaborative relationships with colleagues and learners. Well, if you are involved in this sort of activity, which has been raised by, it's something which needs to be improved, that's been raised by Ofsted, then you're not going to do it on your own. You're going to be working collaboratively. And of course, as APs, that's exactly what you'll be doing a lot of the time in helping quality improvement within a curriculum area by working collaboratively with colleagues in that particular area. And it's not inconceivable that in order to check the efficacy of whatever you're trying to do to improve that situation, that practice is evaluated with others, particularly in relation to intended impacts, what it is that we wanted to see be improved. And then we've got 20, which is a great catch-all for anything that you're doing as an advanced practitioner, which is contribute to organisational development and quality improvement through collaboration with others. That's what it's all about. So we started off with 4 standards there around this issue. We added in potentially another 6 and now another 3. So I make that, 13? Out of the 20 standards from this one issue. So buy one, get a load for free. So, you know, once you start engaging with professional standards, you'll find that actually you're inevitably drawn into engaging with a cluster of them. So hopefully that makes sense. So now let's contextualize this a little bit more. Let's suppose we are wanting to enable learners to share responsibility for their own learning and assessment, setting goals that stretch and challenge. So it's that stretch and challenge again. We start with the standard. Now, the next stage, I would argue, would be, from an AP point of view, that we ought to find out what the evidence base is for strategies which will help to enable learners to share responsibility for their own learning and assessment and setting goals that stretch and challenge. Now, these are just some of my not quite favourites, but ones which I found and certainly agree with through experience. I find that these are actually very relevant and very pertinent and very effective for strategies. And I'm going to leave this PowerPoint without the voiceover, you'll be pleased to know, in one of the modules in Canvas, so that you can go to it, download it, and you can have a look at these hyperlinks. You can follow them through and make your own mind up about them. But what I'm saying here is that if we just start with that standard again, then we might want to consider what the evidence is for doing things more effectively as the next stage. We also then need to be clear about what our vision is. What are we trying to achieve? What is the impact? So again, you know, this is a process of logical or critical thinking about it, which we can all do. I've reasoned that if I needed to achieve this with a bunch of colleagues, then my test, if you like, of whether whatever we've got them to do has made a difference will be whether at some point in the future, which would be agreed, I can clearly see that learners are getting involved in the support or supporting the design of learning activities and learning outcomes. And that comes from the evidence base that I've previously explored, which is in that box. And if you follow that up, you'll see how that links with this whole idea of stretch and challenge and learner responsibility. Well, it starts really with getting them involved in the design of learning activities and challenges. Having done that, the second key point, which is really important, and I would argue the evidence would support this, is that we need to agree, each learner needs to agree what their challenges will be within the whole activity. So they may be looking at the vocational outcomes, the bits which they already can do quite well and skip over fairly quickly within a challenge, and other ones which they might need to spend a lot more time on or get help with. So, you know, we're starting to now differentiate learning and learning outcomes within a whole challenge, which may be done collaboratively by a bunch of learners, if that makes sense. So, and it's not just restricted to vocational outcomes. There may be maths and English outcomes which are individualized within that, or personal skills or interpersonal skills development. Maybe stuff around values and beliefs, for example. Prevent, yeah. Thirdly, I would want to see that the learners are actually engaging in that learning activity and that they are getting involved in monitoring and evaluating their own progress or lack of it. And that comes down to the principles of effective assessment for learning. So, although we've started with enable learners to share responsibility for their own learning and assessment, setting goals that stretch and challenge, it may take us, when we start doing the research, into different areas, you know, about challenge and how to design challenge-based learning, assessment for learning as well. So we need to be able to articulate that vision, and this is a process of contextualizing the standard. And once we've done that, then the next thing is to think about, well, what do the teachers need to do in order to help learners to be doing that at this point in the future? Well, following through again from the evidence base, I would argue in this case, and I'm not stating this as a dogmatic position, but this is just my take on it, and I think I could defend this from a evidence-based perspective. I would suggest that the teachers need to adopt a challenge-led rather than a syllabus or learning outcome-led approach to learning design. So in other words, instead of generating lots of activities to meet learning outcomes, you turn that on its head and you start with the real authentic or realistic activity and then map back to the learning outcomes, which may be very varied, very rich. As we said earlier, could be vocational, maths and English, personal, interpersonal skills and so on. B, the teachers need to ensure that they are able to engage learners and maybe employers if we're going to make it really realistic and authentic for the learner in the co-design of challenges and agreeing what those learning outcomes should be for the overall project and for the individual learner personally. Then C, the teacher needs to support the learner to reflect on what their personal challenges are going to be in that activity and where they may need help. And then finally, they need to require and enable the learners to engage in some form of activity which enables them to record and reflect their progress and support needs in real time. And that would be my argument based on the evidence of how to get learners to do what's in that thought bubble at the bottom of the page, bottom left, in order to meet that standard which is top left. So what we've done is we've done some thinking right from the generic standard right through to, okay, what will this look like in practice? So I hope that makes sense. In the Canvas module, I will also put a tool using an Excel spreadsheet so that you could follow through from particular standards to determine what the vision will be in terms of, if whatever you implement with your colleagues works, what that would look like. But then to follow it through following the Noster 1000 and Villa model, where you then look at other factors like, what skills are needed in order to achieve that vision, what resourcing and so on, right through to action planning. So you might find that tool useful. Okay, so that's it. Any questions? Oh, of course, this is virtual, so there's no point asking you that. You'll have to put your questions on a self-addressed postcard to me, I think. Or, if you want to be a little bit more whizzy about it, you could go into Canvas and you could start up a discussion and invite colleagues to engage and share their thoughts about any of this, and obviously I will respond to that if you wish me to do so. So that's it. Okay, so best of luck with it. I hope that's useful. Bye for now.